Okay, I keep making this video too long, so I'm really going to try to keep this as short as possible. So let me just jump straight into my definition of social justice. It's kind of fourfold. So social justice implies injustice is ongoing and constantly occurring. So concepts of justice need to be enhanced with notions of power dynamics and structural systems that perpetuate violence and oppression. These issues, coming from that viewpoint of social justice, influence social and academic environments in the form of inequities that manifest themselves in the classroom, and also in the form of generational exclusion and institutionalization. So, as educators, we must always work to investigate and illuminate situations or limit situations like Freire mentions that produce and perpetuate inequality and influence the myths and narratives of an imperialist capitalist cultural hegemony. So that is kind of my long form definition of social justice. And kind of moving from that, I am aware of the recent Supreme Court case in New Mexico for the Yazzie Martinez, which specifically identified four main groups that experience the most inequity in New Mexico school education systems. And that being Hispanic students, disabled students, Native or Indigenous students, and English language learners. And of course, also within that, brown students in general, students of color, Black students would also be experiencing these inequities. But specifically coming from that case, teachers need to essentially be aware of that case to get an even better, more kind of specific, contextualized understanding of social injustice in New Mexico. So that's an important thing that teachers, kind of some of the, I forget what it's called, but like the remedies that came from that Supreme Court case are ways that teachers can pursue and enact social justice. So helping disabled students and English language learners and Native students and Hispanic students, and realizing how you can create curriculum that addresses, that is responsive to these students is important. So that's one way that I may plan to enact into a classroom. So I do have a lot to say about the concept of identities and power differentials, but I don't want to go too far into that because I want to make this video as short as possible. But I'm probably planning on having a section in my final presentation that addresses my identities and kind of highlights my viewpoints and my passions to kind of address social justice, not just in the classroom, but in the world, in my community. So I'd rather answer this question of what social justice can achieve, which I would say is liberation. It can transform and restore the way we think of justice in general. It can help us achieve a communal sharing of resources in the world, and hopefully fight for a safer planet. So I think there are obviously many things that social justice can achieve. But I think fighting for a safe and just planet means a lot. And so I'll kind of leave it at that for the sake of clarity. And I'll end up rambling if I keep on answering that question. So another thing I want to say is my role, my view through my definition of social justice, my role as an educator is to help my students place themselves in the narrative of the United States and America. And I think discussing culture and identity is an important in to that understanding, to that learning objective, essentially. So especially in social studies, we have a huge, huge responsibility to incorporate social justice into our curriculum, our pedagogy, our who we are as people, because social justice isn't an action as much as it's a lifestyle. I'm not trying to sound cliche here. It's like social justice is ongoing. My definition of social justice implies that it's on, like injustice is ongoing and constantly occurring. So that's an important thing that we always need to be aware of. And lastly, I just kind of want to mention some theoretical frameworks that I'm working with and that I'm drawing from this book called We Want to Do More Than Just Survive by Bettina Love. And she's very much kind of a scholar of bell hooks. So there's some bell hooks kind of tied into her viewpoint. And she proposes this idea of an educational survival complex and talks about ways that teachers who want to do abolitionist education, some theories that they should incorporate. So the first one would be settler colonialism, which is kind of a reference, which is what my meme is referencing in many ways. Story of America is a story of settler colonialism and slavery and manifest destiny and all these horrible narratives and myths that led to death and destruction of land and the murdering of American bison. And the list goes on and on of the atrocities this country has created and done. So that is an important theoretical framework to incorporate in the class. Critical race theory, this concept of a community cultural wealth, which is part of critical race theory. Black and Indigenous feminism, Black feminism and Indigenous feminism, they aren't necessarily the same thing. So it's important to make that distinction. But also from that, Black and Indigenous solidarity, understanding the history of settler colonialism is the subaltern history of both resistance and, you know, I'm not trying to be too, I don't want to use some theory I don't even understand, but basically, the story of America is a story of destroying other cultures and people for the sake of profit. So that comes from Black and Indigenous feminism, essentially. Core race studies, which is a new term I learned recently, which is kind of like an alternative to queer studies. I think it's an oversimplification to call it like Black queer studies, but it's along those lines. Critical white studies, and that's where you have concepts of like white fragility and disconscious racism, which is super important, and concepts of neoliberalism and manufactured consent. So these different concepts or theories are a big part of how I define social justice and how I kind of name the world and then try to understand the world. So I plan on incorporating those into the curriculum I create and into the text I write and to the work that I do and plan to do with my students. So I hope I didn't make this too long, but that is my definition of social justice. Looking forward to do the rest of this assignment. Have a good one.